So do you ever notice you might have a conversation with some friends in which you express something about something that's going on in the world? Let's say the Israel-Palestine conflict right now. And you say your opinion. You're like, oh my gosh, this is what I think about this. And then you start to disagree, or they disagree with you. And when you start talking to them about it, what becomes quickly apparent is that you actually can't agree on even a basic set of facts about what is even happening. And because of that basic set of facts is different, you start immediately having differences in the cause and effect of what happened and where things came from and why people made the decisions they were making in the first place. And as you talk with them, it seems strange. It's not just the case that you can't agree on a narrative of what happened, but it almost seems like some of the people in the conversation, including maybe you, are just reacting to whatever the last bit of information that came out actually was. You find yourself in a situation in which all of history, maybe all of narrative, both is and isn't true at the same time. That no matter what's happening, it seems to be happening in a kind of eternal present with no explanation, only reactions. And not only are there many different types of narratives that are available which could explain what we're observing in the moment, all of those seem equally plausible to one another. Well, in 2013, this phenomenon was described by Douglas Rushkoff in his book, Present Shock. In this book, Douglas Rushkoff outlines not just narrative collapse, but some other really strange-sounding phenomena like digiphrenia and fractalnoia. Now, this concept of narrative collapse, I think, is extremely important to understand the world we're living in today. This idea of a post-narrative type of storytelling. Now, Rushkoff would say that in years past, human beings had to construct a narrative through their own senses and observations or in conversation with one another. That you would construct a narrative communally and people would basically understand what happened in the world and would be able to interpret it that way. But because we live in a time in which everything is now filtered through the internet, through all kinds of different ways, including deep fakes and edited or photoshopped things and AI creation, we no longer have the ability to really put a narrative together in the way that we used to. And now, all of these stories effectively exist post-narrative. And that world of increasing simulation is what Jean Baudrillard would call hyper-reality. That is, we're living in a type of reality divorced from our actual experience of it. Now, because of this phenomenon, Rushkoff notices that there are three basic things that are going on in media in a reaction to it. The first is that stories tend to not have consequences anymore. And in fact, he cites The Simpsons as a very good example of this. That is, nothing of consequence ever happens in the show. The family doesn't change. It's been almost 30 years. The family is exactly the same. The second is that the viewing experience itself becomes the kind of narrative. That is that you're not watching the Kardashians because it's interesting. You're watching it ironically. You're having fun watching it because you're like, look at these idiots, or whatever your reaction to it is. A lot of reality TV functions from this premise. And the third is that the viewing experience becomes less about consuming the story in order to discover the resolution of the plot and more of a kind of experience of piecing together what's actually happening. And the specific example Rushkoff uses here is The Walking Dead, which is interesting because if you pick up that show at almost any point, you have to spend a bunch of time going, okay, wait, what's actually happening right now? Okay, so what, Brendan? People are consuming media differently. That's always happened. What does that matter? Great question. This becomes less theoretical and far more scary when you begin to apply this to real-world events such as the January 6th insurrection, wherein the people who engaged in it were surprised that there were somehow any actual consequences for their actions. Or people, Donald Trump amongst them, watch what happened with a kind of weird, cool, collected, reserved, oh, look at this craziness that's happening, as if it wasn't actually happening in the world. And finally, an insane, continuous conversation about what actually happened that day, as if for some reason we didn't have tons and tons of evidence of exactly what happened that day. And the consequences of this are extremely grave. We can see it right now. All of the media is continuously talking about January 6th as if it was just a blip in the reality TV show of America and not a dire, insane, crazy, ridiculous, absolutely upending activity in the history of this country. It is because of narrative collapse. That is what Douglas Rushkoff would say. It is because of this increasing hyper-reality that we're in a situation in which we cannot actually agree on any narrative that happened. That is what narrative collapse is, and that is an absolutely terrifying thing for us to all now live in.